introduce Joan Neal and Mara Rutten from our government relations team, and they will start talking to you about the justice reform system and our work on it.
Okay, thank you, Meg, and thank you to all of you for coming today. Just for a little bit of background, since the end of legal slavery, the United States is engaged in criminal legal policies that have disproportionately affected Black and other people of color. The war on drugs began in 1971 under President Nixon and continuing to this day has resulted in over-criminalization, mass incarceration, and police militarization. Harsh mandatory sentencing laws and a focus on punishment rather than rehabilitation has contributed to a deepening racial divide and the perpetuation of structural poverty for families and communities. For these individuals caught in the net of injustice, as well as for the common good, we must dismantle the legal barriers that prohibit every person from thriving. We at Network are advocating for reform to make the criminal legal system more just. We envision an end to racial and ethnic profiling and police militarization, sentencing that stresses rehabilitation and is commensurate with the actual harm done to people in communities, and that encourages, rather than stymies, the reintegration of people with criminal records into the community as full citizens. Next slide, please. This is an issue Network hasn't done a lot of work on in the past, but we are putting more emphasis on it as part of our Build Anew agenda, specifically to dismantle systemic racism, which is pervasive in our justice system, cultivate an inclusive community, and many people with a criminal record face legal barriers to being full members of the community, and to root our economy in solidarity, an economy that discriminates against people with a record and perpetuates the cycle of poverty, and also to ultimately transform our politics. So today we are going to very efficiently give an overview of the issues in terms of policing, sentencing, and reentry, and how we as a network can go forward. Next slide.
Thank you, Mara, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by providing just a little context for why Network is involved with justice system reform. As you know, one of our goals is to shape an economy that works for all. For 400 years now, economic inequality has grown exponentially, leaving millions of people struggling, while the top 0.1% continue to aggregate more and more wealth to themselves. This situation has created an unconscionable gap between rich and poor, and we know that that gap is not just because of market fluctuations, but it is the result of misguided and harmful public policy choices. A core theme of our Build Anew cornerstones is a recognition that racism is a central driver of inequality in our country. And this fact is nowhere truer or more obvious than in our criminal legal system. Any experience with the justice system in this country, especially for Black and Brown people, affects not only the person involved, but their family and their community as well. And it has long-term negative financial and social impact. Studies show that for Black and Latino people, involvement with the criminal legal system is a root cause of generational poverty. And the macroeconomic cost to society is equally devastating due to our national policy choice to use mass incarceration as the sharpest tool in our toolbox to achieve public safety. In this country today, more than 70 million people have a criminal record of some kind, and that exposure to the criminal legal system results in lifetime loss of earning potential. But because of racism, the difference is not felt equally. Last year, for instance, the Brennan Center for Justice reported that Black men are 5 times more likely to be arrested than white men for the same crime, and more likely to receive longer sentences if the crime is drug-related. This report also shows us that people convicted of a crime will likely earn at least 16% less on average than their peers. Those who have been imprisoned will lose around half of their earning potential. Over the course of a lifetime, that loss on average approaches about $358,000 for Black people and $512,000 for Latinos, as compared to only $267,000 for their white counterparts. I don't know about you, but that was a stunning statistic, and it's proof of the structural racism that is built into this country's criminal legal system. The macroeconomic consequences are also significant. Consider the cost to federal, state, and local governments for building, running, and maintaining mass incarceration. Some states, for instance, spend as much on their jails and prisons as on their universities. As a country, we must choose another way. We must pass new public policies that reimagine public safety, that decarcerates rather than incarcerates people, that eliminates racial inequity in the criminal legal system, and that closes the racial wealth and income gap. Next slide, please. So, two issues that are critical to justice system reform are policing and sentencing. To understand the root causes of our mass incarceration problem, we have to look at how our public safety system works, or not. Public safety is served when all people in society feel and are safe in their communities. Unfortunately, we know some communities in America do not feel safe, nor are they safe, astonishingly because of the presence of those who are charged with protecting public safety. We are all too familiar now with the tragedy of over-policing and police violence in Black and brown communities, as we have seen up close these last 2 years. Whatever you think about guilt or innocence in these cases, you must admit that there is no equal phenomenon going on in the white community. Racism is front and center when it comes to police and communities of color. Our current policing practices then rely on a criminalization model that has its origin in the slave patrols that automatically locked people up for any perceived infraction, even when there was no violation of law. For Black, brown, and Native communities, policing is the driving force that pushes people into the criminal legal system, or sometimes to their graves. We cannot dismantle mass incarceration without also dismantling the over-policing practices and state-sanctioned violence in force all across this nation. And all of that is supported by public policies that protect the police at the expense of the people. Across the country, police unions have insisted on policies like qualified immunity and individual discretion around appropriate use of force. Police officers have used these policies to escape accountability for their actions. States and localities have purchased military-grade weapons to use against community members. We need a new paradigm for public safety. We need a model that is focused on serving and protecting all communities, that respects the humanity, dignity, and rights of every person, and ensures equal treatment under law. We were all encouraged and relieved at the Derek Chauvin verdict last week. It sent a strong message that it is possible to hold police accountable for their actions, but it does not solve the policing problem. Systemic reforms are needed to create real change in policing. There is so much more to be done. Next slide, please. So the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is an attempt to take the first step in making systemic changes in the public policies that support our current policing model. Originally, the JPA was introduced in the House by Representatives Karen Bass, Democrat of California, and Jerry Nadler, Democrat of New York, on June 8, 2020, with 230 co-sponsors, including Speaker Pelosi and all of the major leadership in the House. The bill passed the House on June 25, 2020, with a 236 to 181 vote, including 3 Republican votes: Representative Fred Upton, Republican of Michigan, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican of Pennsylvania, and Representative Wilf Hurd, Republican of Texas. But the Senate failed to take it up before the end of the 116th Congress. So on February 24th of this year, 2021, Representatives Bass and Nadler reintroduced the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2021, HR 1280, which had 199 co-sponsors. It passed the House on March 3rd by a party line vote of 219 to 212, although you could say 220 to 212, but the lone Republican that actually voted yes on the bill changed his vote when he realized that he voted for it in error. 2 Democrats, however, voted against the bill, Representative Jared Golden from Maine and Representative Ron Kind of Wisconsin. Next slide, please. So there are many provisions in this bill, as you can see listed on the slide right now. But basically, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically, it aims to address racism and racial bias in policing. It aims to hold police accountable for their actions, to change the culture of law enforcement, to empower communities, and to build trust between law enforcement and the communities they are sworn to serve and protect. Should the Justice in Policing Act pass, it will take a positive step forward in changing policing at the public policy level. Next slide, please. In the Senate, the JPA of 2020 was co-sponsored by Senators Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, and then Senator Kamala Harris, Democrat of California. The Republicans countered with the Justice Act, the Justice and Unifying Solutions to Invigorate Communities Everywhere bill, sponsored by Senator Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina. Now, the Justice Act basically called for more commissions to study the need for police reform, but without any specific actions to implement reform. So that was a non-starter, and there was no action then on policing reform in the 116th Congress. In 2021, the JPA was received in the Senate on March 9th, but there has been no action to date. We understand that Senators Booker and Scott are believed to be in conversation in an attempt to get bipartisan support before reintroducing the bill in the Senate. But we're worried that any concession to the Republicans will weaken the bill. In fact, some of our coalition partners already think the bill is too weak as it is. Qualified immunity and the transfer of military equipment are just 2 of the sticking points in the bill for Republicans. So we will continue to monitor activity to prevent any harmful compromises from ultimately being included in the legislation. Next slide, please. Sentencing is the second area in need of reform to build a new paradigm in public safety, since it is a root cause of mass incarceration. We probably all know this, but the US leads the world in mass incarceration. With only 5% of the world's population, the US holds nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. And that translates into about 1.5 million people currently serving time. That number is staggering. According to the Sentencing Project, which is a nonprofit watchdog organization, the federal prison population has grown by more than 700% since 1980, and federal spending on prisons has increased 600%. Now, a major cause of this growth in mass incarceration was the creation of federal mandatory minimum sentences during the so-called war on drugs in the 80s and expanded in the 1994 crime bill. These fixed minimum sentences for certain crimes has resulted in a criminal legal system that severely curtails judicial discretion, and thus has resulted in overly long and harsh prison sentences, very often for nonviolent crimes. In fact, more than 2/3 of federal prisoners serving life sentences, or what amounts to a life sentence, have been convicted of nonviolent crimes and are subject to these mandatory minimums. But research shows us that not only are long prison sentences unnecessarily harsh, they're largely ineffective in reducing crime. They do, however, result in long-term damage to those who are incarcerated, to their families, and to society in general. They exacerbate the wealth and income gap and are costly to society in both opportunity and actual economic expense. And as we've already stated, they impact disproportionately communities of color and low-income communities, which are often the same when it comes to Black, Brown, and Native communities. Reforming sentencing laws will significantly reduce the prison population, allow those who are incarcerated to recapture some of their earning potential, and help to restore right relationship with their families and communities. Moreover, more than 2/3 majority of all Americans agree that we should reduce the country's prison population. We should pass public policies that focus on sentencing that is proportionate to the severity of the crime, that recognize the human maturation and development process, and allow for sufficient accountability and restitution, but does not consider anyone irredeemable. Next slide, please. So since 2015, there have been two major bills that were developed to address sentencing reform at the federal level. One of them, the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act of 2015, was a sweeping bill that would have significantly lowered mandatory minimum sentences for people with prior nonviolent convictions and applied retroactively to the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. This bill passed the House with significant bipartisan support and passed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee on a bipartisan basis as well. However, Mitch McConnell failed to bring it to the floor for a vote, and so it died at the end of the 114th congressional term. It wasn't until 2018 that another bill, the First Step Act, was actually passed by both chambers and later signed into law by then President Donald Trump. The First Step Act addresses both sentencing and prison reform. Importantly, it reduced federal minimum sentences for certain low-level drug offenses and made those reforms effective retroactively. This immediately made approximately 2,600 federal inmates eligible for case review and resentencing. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimated that over 10 years, the First Step Act will save the federal government, meaning us taxpayers, nearly $80 billion, and it will allow thousands of nonviolent offenders to more successfully return to their families, their communities, and their lives. Next slide, please. Which brings me to the Equal Act, the Eliminating a Quantifiable Unjust Application of the Law Act, HR 1693 and S79. The bill was first introduced in the Senate on January 28, 2021, by Senators Cory Booker, a member of the Judiciary Committee, and Dick Durbin, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. In the House, the companion bill was introduced on March 9th by Representatives Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat of New York, Bobby Scott, Democrat of Virginia, Kelly Armstrong, Republican of Alabama, and Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska. There are currently 12 co-sponsors of this House bill, 8 Republicans and 4 Democrats. However, since it was introduced, there has been no further action on this common sense bill, but we hope that it will gain some steam in the very near future. Next slide, please. The Equal Act is a bipartisan and bicameral bill that seeks to eliminate the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine offenses, a major contributor to mass incarceration, and to apply this change retroactively to those already convicted or sentenced. While there are many provisions in the sentencing laws that produce discriminatory and racist impacts, the crack powder cocaine sentencing law is among the most obvious and egregious. For many years now, research has shown us that there's no scientific nor pharmacological difference between these two substances. Neither is more or less addictive nor more or less likely than the other to produce violent behavior in the user. The difference is that crack has historically been used in more urban communities of color, while powder cocaine, which is typically more expensive, has been found in whiter, more affluent communities. There is no reason these two drugs should be sentenced differently. The racial implications couldn't be clearer. Furthermore, the sentencing disparity between these two drugs has contributed significantly to the growth of mass incarceration. While the Fair Sentencing Act and the First Step Act both reduce the disparity, the fact that there is still a difference at all is indefensible. This bill will eliminate the difference for future sentencing and for all those who have been convicted under the old standard. It is time to end this racist policy and restore proportionality in drug sentencing. The Equal Act can be called a second step in the fight to make our criminal legal system more just and equitable. Congress should pass it, and President Biden should immediately sign it into law. Next slide, please. That is why we ask you to make your voices heard. Lobby your congressperson to do the right thing. Tell them to sign on as co-sponsors to this bill, to invite their colleagues to co-sponsor it as well, and to vote yes to pass the Equal Act when it comes up for a vote. Tell them to take a concrete step toward reducing our prison population now and building a new justice system that is fairer and more equitable for everyone. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Joan, for your discussion of the bill. We're going to come back to that at the end and talk specifically about what we can do as far as Lobby Day. Right now, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the third part of our injustice system, and that is the barriers to reentry. So what happens after a person has served their time or is released? Many believe that once one has paid their debt to society, they could re-enter the mainstream and go about their lives. And any failure to do so is a personal failure. But in fact, a person convicted of a crime in the United States, whether or not they serve time in prison, suffers long-term discrimination in employment, education, and public services. It is, sadly, perfectly legal to discriminate against people with a criminal record in the ways it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Let's take a quick look. In employment, most forms require a job applicant to check the box on whether or not they have ever been convicted of a felony, effectively ending the hiring process for that person. In addition, 1 out of every 5 Americans need a license to work, and even when not specifically barring the formerly incarcerated, clauses such as good moral character can be used to deny a license. Returning citizens also face restrictions on federal student aid. These rules cost men with convictions an average of 9 weeks of employment per year and $179,000 in lost earnings by the age of 48. To make matters worse, having been in the system can put you in debt, not only for court, lawyer, and restitution fees, but for drug diversion programs and mandated counseling. While debtor's prison is illegal in the United States, people who cannot pay these fees are re-imprisoned. If you can't find a job and you can't pay your debts, how do you manage? public assistance? Actually, depending on which state someone lives in, they may also be denied access to health care, though the Affordable Care Act removed the federal barriers to Medicaid, and also denied access to nutrition programs and public housing. The one strike and you're out rule is even more draconian. Any tenant receiving housing assistance can be evicted if they or their guest or visitor engaged in any drug activity, both on or off the premises, which also has an impact on family reunification after incarceration. People are also denied the rights of full citizenship, unable to vote or serve on a jury. It's not a leap to see how this perpetuates a cycle of poverty. If a person's economic, social, and societal life is constrained, is it a surprise that moving up the ladder can feel like climbing up a mountain? There has been movement to correct these prohibitions, but we have a long way to go. Over 70 million people in the United States have a criminal record. That's 1 in 3 adults. Yet we have not reached the groundswell level of real change. Why? Because, as Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, explained, the notion that if you've ever committed a crime, you're permanently disposable is the very idea that has rationalized mass incarceration in the United States. So what do we do? Next slide, please. Become an advocate. Listen, really listen to the stories of those who've been affected with an open mind and an open heart. Do your homework. How did we get here? And why haven't we corrected it? What obstacles do we face to making these changes? Organize and advocate. This is a large issue, so start with one thing, any one thing that touches your heart, and work toward that goal. And finally, lobby. These are legal problems and need to be fixed by changes to the law. Some of the things that have been introduced in this Congress, as we've discussed before, are the policing bills of George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which bans chokeholds and qualified immunity, eliminates the 1033 military program, and ending the death penalty. For reentry, eligibility for public services and restoring the right to vote. And then finally, the Equal Act, ending sentences disparity in crack and powder cocaine, which is one of the underlying issues of mass incarceration and the disparity in the incarceration of people of color. We are focusing on this at Network by having a lobby day on May 12th, in which all of you can make your voice heard by visiting with your congressional representatives. I'll let Meg take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Mara and Joan. Before I talk more about our lobby day, you can actually come back on. We're going to pause for some questions from our participants because we have many. So Mara and Joan, if you want to come back on, welcome. Thank you so much. So our first question, and Joan, this is going back to you on when you were talking about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. What does qualified immunity mean?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah. So qualified immunity shields police persons when they are involved in interactions with community members where there is a use of force. And it allows the police officers to I want to use the word claim, and I'm not using that in a pejorative sense, but to say that they were in fear of their lives, and so they made a split-second decision to use force. And So hopefully that qualified immunity provision and protection will be eliminated through the JPA.
Great, thank you. All right, I have a bunch more here that I am just looking at. Yes, so just Bob, I can answer this one quickly, and I'm sure some of you are wondering. Both this recording and all the PowerPoints will be on our website, and you'll receive a follow-up email. So I know some of you are scribbling notes frantically. Don't worry, that you will get all of this immediate, by tomorrow in your email, and then it'll be up on our website. All right, so moving to, wow, there are a lot of good questions. But moving to the Equal Act, can you tell us, how does it eliminate disparity? Does eliminating disparity mean reducing sentences to the lesser of the two, crack versus powder cocaine?
Yes. Yes, so it would be the same sentencing, whether it's crack or powder. So right now, the crack cocaine has a minimum of a higher amount of time to serve and fines and so forth than does the powder, and this would bring it down so that we're at the lower end and not meeting in the middle.
I think currently the proportion is 18-1 for crack cocaine to powder cocaine.
Wow, 18-1. That is such a huge disparity. So definitely a significant reason why we're asking our folks to come to this lobby day on May 12th and to speak about this. Okay, on. So Joan, you did say that the Equal Act is bipartisan, and we know that it's bipartisan in the House. Is there any bipartisan support in the Senate?
Not yet. And because there has been really no action since the Equal Act was introduced in the Senate, it is unclear whether or not there will be Republican support, but there certainly could be. This is the time when Senator Booker's office and Senator Durbin's office are looking for co-sponsors. So they are out trying to drum up both Republican support and increased Democrat support for the bill.
Great. Wonderful.
And
yes, Mara.
Yeah, well, I will say that there has been a lot of bipartisan support for eliminating extreme sentences and reducing the prison population. So a lot of this work is being done at the state level too. So while we don't have anyone signed on to the bill, it is an issue that does get bipartisan support.
Yes, we've definitely noticed that when it comes to those things. All right, Mara, just in your kind of, when you were talking about reentry, did you, just to clarify, did you say that 1/3 of all American adults have a federal criminal record, or can you walk us through those numbers again, please?
1 in 3 American United States adults have a criminal record. Not necessarily federal, could also be a state record. But yeah, it seems like that can't possibly be true, but it unfortunately is. Now, not everyone has served time in prison. To be clear, you have a criminal record, you might have gone on probation or something like that, but it is still a criminal record.
Thank you. Yeah, that number is mind-blowing. And so I think it was, yes, we had a few people wondering, is that really what you said? And unfortunately, yes, it is. Continuing on the reentry question, When you were talking about licenses, did you mean driver's license or professional license?
Professional licenses. Yeah. So, you need a license for almost everything. To cut hair, you need a license. To become a bartender, you need a license. And there are certain professions where you just cannot receive a license if you have a criminal conviction. And unfortunately, you don't get turned down for your license until after you've applied for it. So one of the things that is being worked out at the local level in some states is to be clear up front that people will not be able to get a license, instead of having them go through the whole process, pay the fee, and then be turned down for that specific issue.
Great, thank you. Continuing, and you just talked about this a little bit with states and licensing laws for returning citizens. But what is the role of a state in sentencing? And I guess, Joan, you can jump in here too, and providing services upon reentry.
Well, with the state, of course, there are state crimes with state penalties. And so each state would control that separately, right? As far as federal programs go, for example, it used to be that if you had a criminal conviction, you couldn't qualify for Medicaid, for example. The ACA, Affordable Care Act, did away with that. But still, as you know, the states control who is eligible for Medicaid and who isn't. So that's still something that is not uniform in all 50 states.
And at the federal level, there are certain things that the federal, well, actually they can both be regulated but in different ways. So states, let's take the death penalty for instance. The federal death penalty can be eliminated, but states can continue to have a death penalty as a sentencing practice in their own states. I think there are 26 or so states that may still have the death penalty in place. And so eliminating the death penalty at the federal level is only in reference to federal prisoners.
All right, thank you, that helps. Are there any states that you can think of that have undertaken policing and sentencing legislative reform that can be pointed to as examples of models that our federal government should think about?
I can't discuss this in any detail, but I will do a shout out to my home state of Maryland, because Maryland just passed a really comprehensive bill, and so I'm pretty proud of that. I don't know if you have more you can say about that, Joan, but
I don't, because Maryland was going to be my example as well, so underscore that.
But I have read many articles about Maryland's really forward-thinking and just bill around policing. And so in our follow-up email, if you're curious about reading, I'm sure we can send you a link or two. All right, we have a few more minutes here for questions. Okay, so this is going back to reentry, Mara.
okay.
So thinking about public housing. If a resident, guest, or visitor has a criminal record, does eviction, and this relates to eviction, does that apply to Section 8 as well as public housing authorities?
First of all, it's drug convictions is the issue, not any conviction. And as far as the Section 8, honestly, I don't know. I couldn't answer that right now. We'll have to get back to the questioner on that.
Okay. Yeah, and just follow-up question, the follow-up to that, I can just say, I think that this question of drug convictions and housing is one of those intersectional areas that Network looks at in our Build a New Public Policy agenda. And so I imagine while we haven't robustly begun working on our housing, I think that we would definitely be addressing this inequality in our housing system, both through our criminal justice work and in some cases our housing work. So definitely one of the wonderful things about our Build a New Public Policy agenda. Yes. So, sorry. So many good questions. All right. So this is about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, Joan. And one of our participants today has heard that the Black Lives Matter movement does not support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And it seems important to be on the same page as our brothers and sisters of color. Can you give any insight into these conversations around coming together on this?
Well, I think that thank you for that question. I think that I mentioned that some of our coalition partners and other groups are not as happy with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act because they think that it doesn't go far enough. For instance, it does not eliminate qualified immunity. It reforms qualified immunity. And the Black Lives Matter movement feels that qualified immunity should be eliminated altogether. So it is things like that that some groups feel need to be strengthened in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I think from our perspective, I think we would take the same position that we did with the First Step Act. The First Step Act was a very weak bill also, but we decided that it was more important to get a piece of legislation on the books and amend it later than to not get it at all. So I think that's the position that we are in. And I respect the question. It's an important question, and we are certainly continuing in conversation with our own partners on this issue. But I think from our perspective, let's move the ball forward, even if it's just a short sprint ahead.
Yes, definitely. So a couple more questions about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. One thing, Joan, you mentioned, of course, I mean, we know part of it is the change in the landscape of the House from the 116th Congress to the 117th, but it did seem like there were many fewer, it passed by many fewer votes than in the last Congress, and there were 2 Democrats who voted against it. Do we have any idea why? This is for our Wisconsin friends out there. But do we have any idea why Rob Kleefisch voted against the bill?
I don't have any specific information on the reason why, but I can conjecture that that he's in a district that perhaps is a little difficult. And considering the fact that there were a majority of Democrats who were in favor of the bill, this was one of those bills where he probably, along with leadership, agreed that he could take a pass. So I don't think that it was necessarily because he disagreed with the bill itself, but I think that he was probably reacting to a situation in, his own district where voting yes would have put him in a bit of a, pickle.
All right. Well, we do have some folks signed up for May 12th in Rob Klein's district in Wisconsin. So I think they can talk about that more and also make sure that he gets onto the Equal Act. So moving back to the Equal Act, so why are we prioritizing it now? Why is it so important? What is the economic impact?
The economic impact of the Equal Act?
Yes, in terms of eliminate what the best economic argument in terms of eliminating sentencing disparities.
Well, as I said earlier, sentencing is a root cause of mass incarceration, and mostly it's because of the mandatory minimums of drug crimes. Certainly have mandatory minimums attached to them. And to the extent that the Equal Act, makes cocaine offenses a felony, they can, if sentences are long enough, they put people in a position of being unable to be in the workforce during their prime earning years. They put their families at risk of economic poverty because there isn't, another wage earner in the household. So anything that we can do to reduce sentences, and in this case, the Equal Act will reduce sentences by eliminating that disparity, will help to improve the economic conditions of those who are incarcerated and their families, and therefore the community.
Great, thank you. Do you have a sense how many people would actually have their sentences reduced because of the Equal Act?
There is a number. I don't recall it right now, but I'd be happy to get that information and get it back to you.
Great, and we'll definitely have that for our lobby day, definitely. I'm sure that information will be there. All right, I think now, since talking more about the Equal Act, we will move on to our call to action. But thank you, Joan and Mara, for answering all these questions. And there's a few we didn't quite get to that I will pass along to you. And we'll make sure that our folks get responses to those. So thank you so much for all these great questions.
Thank you for all the questions. It was great.
All right, so couple of upcoming opportunities. I'm going actually to jump to the second one first. Since the announcement about the verdict last week, Network has been asking all of our members and supporters to call their senators to pass HR 1280, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So if you haven't done that, our number is still open, and you can call 888-496-3502 and ask that they pass the Justice and Policing Act now. Now, moving to our virtual lobby day. So on May 12th, Wednesday, May 12th, Network is hosting our first virtual lobby day on Capitol Hill. And the participants will all be lobbying on the Equal Act, which, as you heard Joan talk about, is the second act in a second step to eliminating major disparities in sentencing between Black and Brown people and white people related to crack and powder cocaine usage. And so for those of you who are on this webinar, I hope that a lot of you watching are already signed up. We have 84 people signed up to join us that day. But if you haven't signed up, you can do that. It's Emily just put it into the chat. Thank you so much. And you've already completed step one, which is watching this webinar. And yes, there will be some lobby training opportunities next week. And then our lobby day is May 12th. And all of this are recordings of this webinar and the slides from the PowerPoint, as well as the materials for the lobby day and recordings of our lobby trainings next week. Everything can be found at networklobby.org/virtual lobby day. And you can still definitely sign up today. If you do want to participate in the day, we welcome you, and we encourage you to sign up quickly because we have to start scheduling these visits, and we want to make sure that everyone gets to meet with their member of Congress. And yes, Network is scheduling these visits, so that is definitely also taking a load off of your plate in terms of preparing for a lobby day. I know some of you do a lot of have worked really hard to get those visits, and this time around we're going to help you out. So definitely join us, join your 85 justice seekers from across the country for this wonderful day, and to start building a new justice system. And yes, Becky, definitely invite others to join you on this day. You know, at Network, we always encourage people to advocate in community, and it's a little tricky with all of these House, you know, with representatives' offices in all of these districts. And so if you have a friend who is passionate about the criminal justice system and racial justice, then invite them to join along, because definitely want to raise our voices to our representatives on this important bill, the Equal Act. So once again, thank you so much, Joan and Mara, for giving us such a thorough presentation, rooting the Equal Act and the Justice and Policing Act in our larger system, and really talking about the economic impact of all of that and the racial and ending the racial wealth gap through building a new justice system. And thank you to my colleagues on grassroots mobilization, Emily and Catherine and Colin and Eilish, for making sure that everything's running smoothly and just helping us create a better experience for all of our viewers. So once again, you'll be receiving this recording in your email tomorrow, and then the link to the slides and everything else that you need as well. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.